Hi, everyone. My name is Robert Reedfar, and I'm the editor of Transition. And I want to welcome you to this very exciting launch of Transition 134. As many of you know already, Transition was founded in Uganda in 1961 by Rajat Nioji, quickly becoming one of Africa's leading journals of politics and culture. The editorship of Transition was eventually fell to Wole Soyinka, followed by Henry Louis Gates, Anthony Appiah, and others among myself. The magazine is now housed at Harvard University and published under the auspices of the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research, also located at Harvard. Our mission is simple. We're committed to publishing the best cultural and political work dealing with the African continent and the African diaspora that we can. Today, we are here to launch Transition 134, titled Home Soon, that features stellar work. I'm going to name all of the people who are in this issue. So please, I beg your forgiveness if I get your names incorrect. But the works that are in this issue are by Jess Silva, Isa Quincy, Lutvini Majana, Miranda Valerie, Stanley Stocker, Taylor Bias, Zakara Galliard, Eviano George, Myron Hardy, Winnell Felix, Adedayo Agarau, Clements Hurd, Celian Larcher, Amy Abugo, Anjiri, Miles Gordon, Marlon M. Jenkins, Courtney Morrow, Abdulkareem, Oku Wudili, Nibu Lisa, Amakojo, and Bhakti Singapore. That is to say, in this issue, we also continue and in fact accelerate our commitment to using the journal to showcase some of the most interesting contemporary artists of Africa and the African diaspora. I'm really thrilled to be with you today to celebrate the launch of Transition's 134th issue. The fact that the journal began publishing more than 60 years ago is remarkable in and of itself. Closer to home, however, Transition 134 is the second number of Transition published during my time as editor. I believe that it is the third issue published since our unbelievably capable managing editor, Tanya Larkin, stepped into her position. If I could just take a moment to brag, I'd like to point out that issue 133, the issue before this one, the climate issue, was also a remarkable moment for us. And I want to give a shout out to Leah Pennyman, who won a Pushcart Prize for her essay, Black Land Matters, Climate Solutions and Black Agrarianism, that was published in Transition 133. I won't go on, but I will say that I am so excited about the work in issue 134, and I cannot wait to hear from tonight's readers. Also, I want to encourage everyone to please engage with our social media. That includes Facebook, Twitter, or X, if you prefer, and Instagram. You'll find lots and lots of great stuff. And especially I want you to look at our social media, because one of the things that Transition does as well is that we're a remarkable art journal, and you get to see an enormous amount of really amazing images. That said, I will give the floor over to my betters, and I wish you all a wonderful, wonderful reading and a wonderful evening. Thanks so much.
All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for attending tonight. My name is Vasanta Sambamurthy. I'm the senior editor for Transition. I've been very happy to be working with Tanya and Robert for these past few issues, as well as our wonderful editorial team, Bizay Banja and Rachel Robertson. Really, to reiterate Robert's enthusiasm for this issue, I am just bowled over by the quality of work that we were able to publish and have the privilege of just being able to feature. And I'm so excited you'll get to hear some of those voices tonight. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first reader, Abdulkareem Abdulkareem. Abdulkareem Abdulkareem is a Nigerian writer and linguist. He holds a BA in linguistics from University of Ilorin in Nigeria. A recipient of the highest Best Creative Writing Award for Excellence, he won the University of Ilorin SU Writers Competition in the poetry category and was shortlisted for the 2022 Vallum Poetry Award. He's also an alumnus of the Spring Writing Fellowship in 2022, and his works appear and are forthcoming in Poetry Magazine, Natroot, Sand Journal, Lalwe, and elsewhere. He is currently a poetry reader for Agbowo Magazine and Frontier Poetry. Please welcome Abdulkareem.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Abdulkareem Abdulkareem. So I'm a Nigerian writer. So I'll be reading some of my poems that appear in the issue, the Transition magazine issue. So the first one I'll be reading is titled Threshold, the Threshold Photograph. This poem was written after a photograph of my parents because I didn't grow up to know them together as parents. When I grew up, I only knew one of them because the other had died when I grew up. So I so on a certain day while going through this photograph, I felt a kind of feeling, a kind of very huge surge of feelings. So while like going through the photograph, I wanted to see something because the photograph was telling me something. So it was how I got to write this poem I'll be reading now. So I'll begin. The threshold photograph. The story begins on the landscape that bellows with the sultry touch of the burning sky. They never learned the art of sharing flowers. Their gates, so sacred, their shoes, the color of the tip of a cornfield. I stare into my mother's blood face. I wonder if it drowned in tears of joy before person. Her veil unfolds her small body like the arms of a longing couple, and her left hand wears the loveliness of two rings to channel the beauty of a bride. And my father enfolds a hand round his other hand like passing a brother. White fabric wraps round his neck, and the white lace, like the purity of the white tile in my neighborhood mosque, portrayed him with the gait of a ghost. Of course, he's not a ghost, feeding on a century of his wife's offerings, and a boldly written RIP rests on the side of the photograph. His lips looked calm, but like a mouth too heavy for language. Mother said he was a welder of words in consistent spirit. How ironic. They didn't seem happy. They didn't peer at the camera, each one of them gazing into the emptiness that grew with their marriage. So, I'm done reading the first poem. I'll be moving to the second poem. So, the second poem is titled Somewhere Between the Prime and the Obsolete. So I got the first inspiration for this poem because of it was majorly about how fickle life can be, how we can be in the best, and then after a few years or months, then we are at the lowest, or we can be at a very high place now, and then in a few years we are at the lowest. How things can disappear, how the best things become so low, how everything dissolves so quickly. So it was what gave me the inspiration for this poem. So that's why I had to write this poem. So I'll start reading the poem now. Somewhere between the prime and the obsolete. Sugar crumbled on my tongue, and there was a sweet heaven. The aftertaste slipped away, like a sand of sand, fading into the wind, like the heat of a foundry, rubbing a palm which becomes lesser in distance. There was a room stuffed with music, the solemn sound of vibrant pianos, the memory-streaming guitars and ukuleles, and saxophones that blend the voice of concurrent longings. A group of men recording consistency on the eyes of their lives. I walk into this room once again, after the ripple of years. Their hands pouring the music were blue and fluid, carrying a fragment of the elegies of this world. And the bodies bereft of these elegies were drilling songs fading in the silence of time. Every event of time begins a new history for man, before the creation of memories, and time is always on the bridge of its prime, like a burning candle without end. A cliche once was the beauty of language, before its words nosedived like a paper plane, succumbing to gravity, and expression becoming obsolete from all the illness of this world. In his room, I traced my grandfather into a monochrome, where he was a sapling, carrying the weight of his adolescence, face creamed with lushness, the body stout and tall like the mango tree in his backyard. The consistency of a thing dwindles when its body becomes a rust of time. The body admits its use before it disposed of its core, the soul, or the deadline anchored over it by the duration of its mortality. My grandfather still carries the act of an alpha, but the ray of his sunlight blankets into impermanence. And when a river becomes a tree, the land augurs in this yawning era, creeping through the years past its heydays. Somewhere, there's a motion morphing to stone, a body, admitting a cold silence, a blue orchard in a slow storm, abiding to dissipation. I'm done reading both poems that appear in the visual. So, can I? So, am I to end or?
You can read some others if you, otherwise we can move on. That was terrific.
Okay. Okay. Probably I'll just read my poem that appeared recently, Mizna. So it's kind of a long poem. So the poem is titled Eid al-Fitr in Ilorin. It was written after Rumi Origun. It was a poem written on a morning, an Eid morning. So I'll begin. Again, the morning comes alive like a season of harvest, of prayer. I unmask the day, my mouth cascading clean waterfall of a bright-eyed smile. Holiness dawns on me, and I bow to a single Alhamdulillah, like a wide stereo. Today, earth embodies the aloe, saying one of its most sacred forms. I break into force with my brother, our bodies one with neatly embroidered agbada, like an ushibana, embracing the kinetism of our bodies, holding on to prayers like weapons of war, as if we were compelled by a spell to hold on to them. In our journey, there is no loud music blaring in distance. The road, pervaded with an army of milkboats on the other side of the road. A group of men in sections chants the glory of Eid, others beating the life of the bandiri drum, the kind that needs the bare wideness of the palm with the absence of drumsticks. In moving closer to Unity Road, on this day, the roads become a haven of God, a place to whittle your grievances to the all-encompassing, igniting your prayers with big, bold radios, posting waves as sounds, laid closely to their prayer mats, transmitting the soul of the masses' voice with cracks, say fragments of nomads completed their journey of movements and listened to cracking voice of each from their abode of withdrawal. With my brother and other unknown itinerants, we do not wave the right flag of surrender. We seek the heart of the prayer ground, which means we do not capitulate the haven of our dreams, seeking the light. And I have learned about light, but I do not mean photons. I mean the sweet voice of God that dawns on us in the flesh of the Mams. On our way home, we gather our grief like the mother, gathering everything important to her. The shadows of our sins flung in our breast pockets. So we've embraced once again the ripple we toppled away when we trek towards the paradise of Eid. So we do not return through the paths that brought us here. Like a colony of ants returning from exile, we journeyed, embracing the misdeed we left behind. There is enough ripped faith waiting for us at home. So I will stop here. I'm done reading the poem that appeared on Mizna. So thank you for having me here.
Thank you, Abdulkareem. That was terrific. And now I'm going to spotlight Vasantha again.
Yes, thank you so much for those beautiful poems, Abdulkareem. Even hearing them read, I think, is a different experience than reading them, but I've included the links so that anyone in the audience can feel free to reread and enjoy their beauty. Following that, I will also be posting a link to the story for our next reader, Jess Silva. So I'll go ahead and post that link for anyone who wants to follow along. And here's a little bit about our next reader, Jess Silva. Jess Silva is a writer and poet from the South Bronx. They hold a BA from Columbia University, an MFA from Vanderbilt University in creative writing fiction, and are currently pursuing their PhD in creative writing at the University of Cincinnati. They have received a Displaced Artist Fellowship from Vermont Studio Center, a grant from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, a May Fellowship, and serve as president for the Disabled and Deaf Writers Caucus. Jess's first novel, the story of a tight-knit immigrant community rattled by the war on drugs, goes on submission this fall. Please welcome Jess.
I'm so excited to be here. I think I don't think I could start my video up. Yeah, but that's okay. You can just
I'm
listen.
trying. If you could just
Oh.
wait like 2 minutes, I'm just trying to like
Okay.
get the video to work again.
Oh, no worries. I can just start.
Yes.
It's totally
And thanks everybody.
fine.
Hold on just a second.
It's totally fine. Technological issues. It's like technology. You either love it, you hate it. There we go. I've done this before, clearly. Thank you everyone for tuning in. Thank you so much, Vasanta, for that beautiful introduction. Yeah, I'm super excited to read this piece. This is actually my first long piece that's been published. I'm normally a poet and flash writer, so this is actually in the novel that's going on submission this fall. Fingers crossed, it'll be in a book in like 2 years. So yeah, I wrote this piece after I had my own experience with a family member in hospice, and that's what inspired it. So just kind of content warning, there's some death, there's some hospice stuff. But other than that, hopefully you enjoy. Thank you so much for being here and listening. So the title of this piece is An Excessive Number of Beautiful Things. Nina had only been on the floor an hour when the patient in bed 322 died. The resident. The staff at Shady Oaks were supposed to call the people in their care residents or clients, not patients. It had something to do with making the residents feel like they were paying for a service. It wasn't good to remind them how sick they were. Nina wasn't a nurse, just a CNA, so there was nothing she could have done. She tried to bind random tidbits of information into her long-term memory as Leon and Dr. Beale did their jobs. That would be her one day working the crash cart. Dr. Beale started compressions and the sickening crunch of cracked ribs filled the room. No DNR? Nina whispered to Therese. No, some people want to live. But dying was inevitable, especially at Shady Oaks. A few minutes passed before Dr. Beale took her hands off the resident's chest. I'm calling it. She stepped back, looked at the clock in the room, and made a note of the time. Amber and Leon began discussing the next of kin. If they were nearby, the staff would wait and let the family come and say their goodbyes. If not, the body would be transported and held in the morgue. The white coat and blues left the room, leaving Therese and Nina in their puke green uniforms to finish preparing the body for transport. Nina grabbed the crisp white bed sheet at the end of the bed and held out the opposite corner to Therese. They shook the sheet high into the air. For Nina, 3 things happened at once. She saw Therese on the other side of the bed, her eyes looking up at the billowing sheet, the ceiling, or maybe toward heaven. The second thing that happened was that Nina remembered the giant parachute her first grade class played with during gym. She remembered the colorful patterns cast a rainbow on the waxwood floor, and across the way, Kenny Rodriguez smiled at her. He had just lost a tooth, and his smile was all gnarly and wet. Then the parachute fell over the class, and she lost sight of him. The third thing that happened, Nina couldn't understand. She saw death, just a glimpse, just a peek, but she knew it was him all the same, the stranger standing near the bed, looking both as real as Therese and as evanescent as the memory of Kenny smiling at her. Nina was good at seeing what others didn't see, at taking in every sound, speck, and smell. She recognized people by their footsteps and anticipated their moods. That was how she survived. But this was something else. You see me. It was more a thought than a voice. It lingered as the sheet fell back onto the bed, onto the body lying in it. Then the voice and the figure were gone. Nina? Did you see that? Nina asked. What? Therese looked down at the bed. Mr. Avis Johnson, veteran, grandfather, now just a body. His eyes were closed, a small blessing. Nina had to close a pair of eyes once, weeks ago, and sometimes she still felt a phantom tickle of eyelashes against her palm. I don't know what I saw, but Nina did know. The name rattled in her throat, then forced itself back down and lodged underneath her ribs. I guess my eyes are playing tricks. Therese nodded. We're all too tired. Our eyes don't even know what they're seeing. Nina looked down at the body and frowned. How many is this today? Just the first, which means we'll probably get another one tonight. It's still early, Nina said. She imagined death settling in for the night the way visitors do, grabbing a cup of coffee or cocoa, curling up in an uncomfortable chair, leaning forward each time a nurse or doctor entered the room with news. Therese was standing in front of the large calendar in the hallway, hands on her hips, when Nina exited the room. The calendar was full of things for the residents to do, everything from bingo to music nights to pedicures. Today's offering was wild raptors. A volunteer from a nearby animal sanctuary brought 2 owls, or sometimes a hawk, for the residents to pet and ooh and ah over. During last month's Wild Raptor show, one of the owls had pooped in the dining room. The volunteer had excitedly pried the shit nugget open, showing the residents the tiny little rat femur inside. Bed 122 had thrown up her soft scrambled eggs all over her table, and now the Wild Raptor show took place in the solarium at the front of the ALF. Goddamn birds, Therese whispered. If there's poop in that solarium and they expect me to clean it up, I swear to God. They're a fan favorite. Nina trailed off as she glanced back at bed 322 and pictured the body under the sheet. Transport would be up in a few minutes, so the CNAs had to go around closing the resident doors for housekeeping. No one wanted to see a dead neighbor wheeled around the halls. Death still hit you hard, huh? Nina was brought back to the conversation. Oh, yeah, sometimes. Therese lowered her voice. That's normal, you know. You shouldn't grow numb to people's pain. But Nina knew Therese had grown numb to it. She counted the dead and then thought about her dinner. Once, as she waited for transport to come get a body, she thought so longingly about a pastrami sandwich on rye, extra mustard, that she moaned a little. The newly widowed woman sobbing at the bedside glared at her, and Therese had to dab her eyes and pretend that she had moaned in sorrow. She told the story in the break room to gasps and laughs, then moaned extra loud as she bit into her sandwich. Mustard dripped onto her chin. So worth it, she said. Nina's beeper went off when she returned to the nurse's station. It was her mother. Get milk on your way home, Juana said. You drank it all. Nina frowned. The last thing she wanted to do after an overnight shift was to stop at the supermarket. But she knew her mother would bitch about the price if she shopped at the bodega on the corner instead. It's a whole extra $1 a gallon. She could hear her mother chastising her. The last time Nina had overspent on groceries, Juana had made a big deal of calling the food stamps hotline, getting the balance, and reconfiguring the entire food budget. As if the solution wasn't simply to drop one thing from the menu, canned tuna instead of pork chops. There, problem solved. Now that she had graduated high school and completed CNA certification, Nina was saving up to move into her own place, a small studio apartment right off the 1 train in Washington Heights. She didn't know which building yet, but the neighborhood was full of small spaces. The landlords were always cutting a 3-bedroom into pieces, shoving a stove and a fridge in any place they'd fit so they could call the apartment an efficiency. Nina didn't mind. Amber came strolling down the hall, rolling the blood pressure machine in front of her. Hey, Sarah was asking for you. Sarah? Nina cocked her head. Your friend, the little old lady in her old personal museum. Nina remembered little things about her residents, their favorite foods, how they liked their coffees, and the trinkets they cared about the most. Last week, Bed 32 had mentioned a red brooch his mother used to own when he was young, and Nina spent 3 hours at 6 different thrift stores looking for something that seemed close enough. Bed 32 was overjoyed, but names never stuck. When Nina tried to recall them, the letters would twist and distort themselves, and the sounds garbled in her mouth. It was easier to give everyone pet names, and she sighed with relief when most of the residents let her get away with honey. It seemed a Southern thing, even though she wasn't Southern and gave no twang to the word. Bed 40, Sarah, was Nina's favorite. Sarah was 88, widowed, and a former small-time singer in the chorus of old musicals. Once a season at least, the resident movie night would feature a movie she was in. A CNA, usually Therese, would stand by the television and point out a young Sarah singing and dancing in the background. See her right there. All the residents would lean forward and squint their eyes at the shadow kicking its legs and shaking its hands in the air. Sarah was in the early stages of dementia, meaning she remembered these moments less and less. But it wasn't dementia that would kill her. It was her weak heart and its faulty beats. Sarah always had a wet cough, a symptom of the fluid collecting in her body. Her extremities had started to mottle, and most of the time she stayed in her room, which the staff called the museum. When Sarah moved into Shady Oaks, it had been a production, or at least that's what Therese said. Most people moved in with only a few bags. They either did not need many things, or their families had already pared down their belongings and taken the good china. But not Sarah. When she moved in, she brought boxes of treasures, dresses from the 1950s, costume jewelry, and small wooden chests, and lamps with soft light bulbs that gave the room an autumn glow year-round. Nina was particularly enamored with a tiny vintage Shiseido lipstick that had to be applied with water and a brush. Therese's favorite thing was a hat box filled with buttons. More than once, Nina walked in on Therese with her fingers in the box, raking the buttons like sand. You can tell which ones are good, Therese said, because they're cool to the touch. Nina had never thought of buttons being good or bad before, but she realized that Therese meant that the cool ones were expensive. It was the difference between paralyzed and pearls. I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that engrossing excerpt from the story. It was such a pleasure to hear it read. Our next writer is going to be Adedayo Agarau. So Adedayo Agarau is a 2023 Wallace Stegner Fellow and a Cave Canem Fellow. He's the editor-in-chief of Agbowo, an African magazine of literature and art. His work has been featured in Poetry Magazine, Poetry Society of America, World Literature Today, and elsewhere. So please welcome Adedayo.
Hi everyone, I'm so excited to be here and to be reading with such amazing people. Yeah, I'll be reading about 3 to 4 poems. I'll be reading 2 poems from Transition, which I'm actually really excited to be published by. I'll start with Migration. So I am actually working around collection of poems that is discussing the spirituality of being lost, the spirituality, and it's actually with surrealism. So I'm discussing kidnapping and chronicles of kidnapping in Nigeria in the 90s, Nigeria, and the early 2000s. Migration. The mother's body quivers in the kitchen. The tea burns her tongue. The tea kettle whistles, boiling the skin of her child. The purple kitchen tumbles her eyes. Facing the slab, yellowish orange sits atop the highland, waiting for hands, its shadow leaning against the wall near the window. To be honest, what would only be lost is half of what you know. The priest is filling the aluminium basin with distilled water once brought to boil on the charcoal. The child is on the bed that is on a rock, breathing in the sequence of tethered wings on a hot June afternoon. We ask who holds the heads, what hope is there for this poisoned child? What secrets the dark room holds? Who is moving towards shore? And who the river brings back to? When it reaches its destination, it is without but it is still music. So the child is still a child, even if it's breathless. Even if the horses outside are dropping dead like stones landing in water. The priest's mouth and incision of prayer, he sprinkles salt on the naked child. Ikulo, Karolo. In a flash, the knife tears open the wrist of this child and fills it with praying flowers. Child of lavender, sneeze. Bring from this drowning the happiness excreted off of your mother's body. The priest washes the child's head. What the God wants is that the poison shifts place, that the drowning body is pulled out by shadowing another alive. The ritual roams in flames, the incense escape through the window. Down the river, the sun glistens on a small rock. Anywhere light is found is where these gods feast. Shadows flee through the walls, into the hall, into the kitchen where the mother is waiting. Through the small pores of her skin, the poison enters. She performs the grand gesture of falling to the ground, into the ground, into the ground. Thank you. The second poem I'm going to be reading is We Daydreamed of Angels. Months later, we were still tilling the fields, searching for whistles in the wind. We doubted the flood and taught our children to run and fill their clothes with hair. We went to church and prayed, hosted vigils on the streets, and fathers who didn't care about God drank gin and chatted with other fathers who didn't care about God. The tires burning all night blew into the morning sky. The river flowing past our street dumped decomposing carcasses of children kidnapped after school hours. And like phrases, their bodies an incomplete sentence. The hot air in the afternoon swept silence through the empty soccer field. We would listen to the news at 7, waiting for familiar names of missing children. Mothers plaited our hairs rough, and made us cold zobo. We daydreamed of angels through our father's windows. We watched the sun sink into oblivion, like all the children whose blood has ripened someone else's ritual rites. So I'm going to be reading. I first want to say thank you to the editors for actually selecting these works. They actually mean a lot to me, and they're part of my manuscripts, which, of course, I'm trying to get published. I'm going to be reading another poem from the manuscript. It's titled "Ghost of a Dead Boy Writes from Soka." In the gloaming, algae on the walls blossom. A bowl of blood is an answered prayer, a child's call, a new path. Yellow chrysanthemum wilts as wind flares the embers of this catalysm. I think of my mother's love, the bluest desire in my eyes. I met a girl here whose smile in the scorn of this house reminded me of you. The bones on the ground, dried femurs of diminutive dreams, rinsed their teeth with blood. How are you? We arrived numb, forgetful of home, and we sat in the dark, cockerels and crickets turning time within us. Sometimes the sound of drums from the church beside the house drowned echoes from the shrine. When it's loudest is when the soul begins to sink. My mother, how is she? Tell her I came home a few times, touched her skin and left. I dream of flowers and empty houses and bands of yams and break time at Bodma. I dream of roads littered with school uniforms, our mothers searching for their boys. I dream of you, where light seeps out of my body, my blood calling you. Once, a band of boys arrived one evening. One of them was someone I knew from Oguleye Street, Fola. his dreads short and his uniform untidy. I smiled. I cannot speak, so I nod at him. His eyes full of fear acknowledged the terror. Where did they catch you? I asked silently, pretending I could not speak. Pretending we were on the lawn playing football, cloaked in sweat. I'm happy to see you. The final poem I'm going to be reading today is Boys That Never Die, after Safia Elio. Boys that never die. Boys that dance around plastic chairs in front of barber shops to win a free haircut. Boys that gaze at the moon and fabricate a story about a man who left his mother and turned into a moon man. Boys that love their mothers, run after cows on Ogunleye Street. When ice cream melts and slings down the ham, boys lick their ham. Corn boys, yam boys, boys that never joke with food. Boys that show us new shoes their fathers got them, joyous boys, laughing like the sea, boys that call me friend. Boys that buy me sweets, goody goody, Quadri, Olushola, Adams, Ogunkoya, Saida Pari, Penka, Ademola, Oluwatosin, Mido, Shegun, Olua Soji, Kayode Karim, Adewusi Sheyi, Bukola, Olatunji, Olushola, Damilola, James, Tola, Daramola, Taufik, Ibrahim, boys puzzled by God's grace. Boys that open their eyes during prayers. Boys in love with the same girls, boys fighting over girls, boys without flowers, boys with flowers, boys that love boys, boys that love boys that love boys, boys that hide, boys that seek, boys jumping thin lines of life playing suwe, snake and ladder boys, boys watching their father's father play draughts, paraga boys, boys that like the smell of cigarettes but swear they would never smoke. Boys that feel ground chalk in rolled paper and puff. Boys in the kitchen filled with smoke. Boys that carry scars from playgrounds. Boys that carry scars their father gave them. Boys that don't listen. Boys that listen. Boys that revolt. Boys that leave home. Boys that would never be absent like their fathers. Boys who watch their fathers at bars, down the streets. Boys that search for their fathers in the dark. Hungry boys. Dreamy boys, boys that teach boys how to wang, boys kissed by older women, boys kissed by young women, boys the hope of a chameleon, always changing, Saturday boys dancing to Ebenezer Obey, Tom and Jerry boys, Saturday special on BCOS, worldwide wrestling with Shawn Michael boys, Tinko boys, boys that love bright colors, I wear yellow and you wear sky blue, little stars dotting the sky, noisome boys, boys that kiss girls, boys that love God and go to church in their best shoes, home boys, street boys, boys that leave home for school one morning, their corrupted bodies litter a small farm days after. Yeah, thank you.
Adedayo, thank you so much for that powerhouse of reading. It was such affecting pieces to read on the page, but to hear them read is, again, completely different experience. And thank you so much for giving us a glimpse into your manuscript as well. All really excellent and, yes, remarkable work, as Robert has said. Thank you so much also for everyone still hanging around and listening attentively to our wonderful readers. Our last reader of the night is going to be Stanley Stocker. So Stanley Stocker is an African-American Mexican writer and the winner of a 2021 PEN America DAW Prize and a 2023 Creative Power Award and a finalist for the 2022 Best Spiritual Literature Award in Fiction. His work has appeared or is forthcoming in Kestrel, Brittle Paper, Superstition Review, Susurrus, Middle House, and on the Short Story Today podcast. Please welcome Stanley. Also a Harvard graduate.
Thank you so much, Visantha, and thank you, Robert and Tanya and all the editors. It really was an honor to be included in Transition. I'm going to read a portion of an excerpt from my novel, which is I'm Now Shopping Around to Agents, and it's called The World Is Not My Home. It's a story of a father quest set in the early part of the 20th century, Mississippi. And in this scene, the main character, Samuel, who is a young boy, he's 13 years old. Back in those days, they did send 13-year-old boys to prison with adults, unfortunately, in Mississippi. In this scene, it's a rainy day in this parchment farm. It's a working farm. And the men are telling stories. And this particular story is being told by a man called 44. It's called The Levee. They say the boy is brave that travels up the highway independent of his people. But I know it's having them anchoring him at home that allows him to set off. A boy can branch out when he's got his people to anchor him. That's why one early morning, me and my dog, the General, left out to see a new part of the world, leaving my mom and my daddy sleeping behind us. We walked a long while using the river to keep us company, all the way down out of Tekakwitha County into Cherokee. Slept out under the night in the stars, made camp with some roustabouts on the river near Levittown. Ate with them, talked, shared some ska. They like a boy that means to travel, puts them in mind of their own beginnings. We passed a day and a night there, hopped a steamer around midnight, and the river carried us down around Natchez. We stood on the bluff and watched the steamers rolling up and down the river. Outside Natchez, me and the General walked along the road, then sat a while, watching the people pass by. Fellows going to market, cotton, big old wagons full, hogs looking out from the back of great big old wagons. We walked along down the road and passed by this house. Damnedest thing I ever saw. It took me a while to see it. It was right there in front of me, though I ain't seen it at first. We were standing there looking over the place, and I hear somebody calling. I look around, and there's a man waving his arms from the portico of this grand house. I turn around to the road, but he's steady, calling and waving, beckoning me to come up. So I open the gate and go in. Road to the house covered with these white shells, and it's crunching under my feet as I go. The man steady waving on, come on, come on. I could use your help, he says. That's right, come on. I saw there were two fellas up on the portico. The one calling me to come on, he's standing up with his hands in the air. The other fellow sitting with his face pressed in a book. He never looked up when I got there. Son, the tall man said, do you remember your Latin? You study Latin, haven't you? No, sir, I say. Then the little man looks up from his book, and they both look hard at me. The little one returned to his book, grumbling, his finger running down the page. That's when it hit me. The thing that I felt, but couldn't quite name until right then. White. Everything on the place is white. Whitest house I'd ever seen. Tall white columns, high white walls, white shells in the road, big boulders painted white, set here and there along the road, leading up to the house, like they mean to catch you if you get too close. A white horse standing in the field out back. Come to think of it, these two fellas, head to foot dressed in white. Percy, the little man said without looking up, it says it right here. And I say, I don't want to hear it, I won't have it, and you know I won't. The gentlemen were in the middle of some dispute, which they hoped I could settle. But now that they saw I couldn't, they looked crossly at one another. The tall, thin man leaned against a pillar and stared off, and the little one shut the book and folded his arms across his chest. I will not have it, he said. Our daddy would not have it, and neither would his daddy. It is science, the little man began as if to explain, but the tall one cut him off. Speak no more of it, Perry. It's an abomination. I'm telling you, it's an abomination. The little fella turned on his heels and walked inside, slamming the door behind him. I started to call to the general from the garden when Mr. Perry, the younger brother, spoke up. Don't mind my brother, son. We have endured a hard loss in the death of our auntie, and it has put us in the mind of the end of all things. Now, my brother only thinks about his end times, though he's still a young man. Now, these fellas was my daddy's age, if they was a day, and my daddy was not a young man even in those days. He thinks only of his final days, he said, and the ceremony for his own burial. As you can see, he will not abide a single black thing on the place. He hushed his voice when he said the word. Will not abide it, and he torments himself with the thought that some guest in honor of his passing will don the color of mourning against his wishes. Now, I try to tell him he need not worry, that he'll be beyond the care of such things, but he will not have it. We thought we might settle the issue by looking in this here book, but our Latin studies was too long ago. When we saw you on the road, he hoped you might help us. He looked down at the gate at the wagons traveling the road. Why not have a rehearsal? I said. My daddy belonged to the lodge, and whenever they know a member is traveling, the men look to the wants and desires of the fella by way of music and such. And they practice beforehand to get it right. My daddy always said, the living need light and the dead need music. He also said, ain't nothing like laying on a cooling board to make a man's wishes ignored. But I didn't pass that on to Mr. Perry. Oh, I knew there was a reason my brother called you, he said. Brother, the young man has come up with the solution. And into the house he went, slamming the door behind him. I called to the general and was ready to walk off when the two came back outside. Oh, young fella. The skinny brother said and hugged me tight. You brilliant boy. I knew it, saw it as you were walking up the road. They insisted that I stay on for all the preparations. Said they would have a feast and call all their relations to make sure all went well when the real time came. Oh, they was happy. Well, they did just as they said, made arrangements for relations to come from all over the county. Even called to some distant relations up north to make certain all the mourners would follow Mr. Perry's last wishes. And while the arrangements were being made, the mortician and the barrel maker set to making a coffin for Mr. Percy's body, the dressing of the windows, the hiring of 5 white horses from Jackson to go with the one in the field, the food preparations. While all this was going on, Miss Millie, the housekeeper of the place, steady giving me the stink eye like she smelled a rat. But the gentlemen had given their orders, and Miss Millie was bound and obliged to obey. So she set me up with the finest foods in the grandest wing of that grand old house. The general, too, I tell you no lie. Even the general got a taste of things the governor of Mississippi himself be happy to sit down to. We had it so good. But before I finished the last part of this fine meal, housekeeper Millie learned how to keep me tied to her apron. I was dragooned for kitchen help. Asked me what I knew about kitchen work, so I asked her what she knew about dogs, seeing how I had little interest in the subject. She gave me a sharp look, and that was that. I was corralled. A full day's work. I learned more than I ever wanted to about funeral fare. Tomato aspic, fried chicken, stuffed eggs, butter beans. She took a bushel of eggs and spelled out Walker on the and itching to break free and walk the place. I drew the line at stirring up a batch of banana nut bread. When the houseman come by to see if I could help him with arranging the table and setting out the silverware, oh, I got in the wind, hitched my wagon to his long enough to break free of Miss Millie, and got in the wind. her eyes burning a hole in my back. Well, after I finished helping the house man, me and the general just roamed the place top to bottom. And you know what? Every book in every room was full of these little men dressed in white, sitting at a little desk facing the open windows. And on each desk, a white sheet of paper. And carved on each desk was, "Look thee into thy heart and write." I didn't know what to make of all this, so I stood by and watched from behind a bookshelf to see what all these fellas was about. Every now and then, I'd see a man ring a little bell from the corner of his desk. After he rang the bell, he'd get up, lean out the window, pen and ink in hand, and write on the paper. Then he'd go back to his seat and start writing in one of those big white books. While most of the white-suited men seemed to ring a little bell before they went to the window, some of these fellas just raised a tall white feather high above their heads and then leaned out over the sill so that the room was full of tinkling bells and feathers floating all around. Of course, I wanted to find out what all of this was about. So I went around to the garden, and what did I see? Little boys of about 10 years old sitting on little stools. I waited till I heard a bell and watched as somebody sitting under the windowsill lifted a book high over his shoulder without raising his head. Then I saw the men leaning over and copy something out of the book and disappearing again. Quite naturally, this was a puzzle to me. And first chance I got, I went over to one of these boys and asked the meaning of these strange events. The boy asked me if I had come to spell it. Seems he had been waiting for some time for a chap to take his place in the raising of the little book. When I said I was a guest of these two fine gentlemen, he shrugged his shoulders. "You sure you ain't here to spell me?" He said, "I got to go to the bathroom, something awful." So I made him a deal. I'd take his place and let him run to the loo if he promised to tell me what was going on. He agreed. He said, "I got a bell ringer, so if you hear it, just raise the book over your head and I'll explain when I get back." Off he ran, and no sooner was he gone when I hear ring, ring. So I lift up the book and hold it there for what must have been 5 minutes, it seemed like, until he rang it again. By then, the boy was back and we changed places, and it was his turn to keep his word. "Well," he said, "Mr. Percy takes powerful to his books. God must be like 1,000 of them. But he won't have nothing black on the place. And this here," he displayed the pages of the open book to me, "full of nothing but." And just as he said, the book was full of words and black ink like ants running across the page. So the fellas inside, they copied down the words in blue ink mostly, though Henry, he got a fella crazy for brown. "But you boys still own the place out here in the garden, and the garden is on the place," I said. "True enough," he said, "but we ain't in the garden strictly, not by Mr. Percy's lights, because of these." He pointed to the little white crates that his feet were perched on. It was the same with all the boys up and down the road. If we sitting on the stool and got our feet on the crate, he say we ain't rightly on the place. It was the same all over. The Walkers, for that was their name, had done everything they could to keep anything of the forbidden color off the premises. Of course, I was the blackest thing on the place, being light-skinned of a light-skinned mama, and a daddy the color of dark chocolate. You take the average black man off the street and ask him what I am, he bothered you even trouble. He don't need half a second to see something that's clear enough to a babe in his mama's arms. White man look all day, long and can't see. I could have come out looking just like my daddy before me, but they ain't know that. So I took my ease walking the garden of the halls of these two fine gentlemen. Finally, the day arrived, and all the relations had gathered round, all dressed in white the way Mr. Percy wanted. The mayor of Natchez and your various and sundry muckety-mucks from the town came. They all gathered out front, lining the walk. I was there too, outfitted by the gentleman as an honored guest. My black soul hidden by the fine clothes given to me by the brothers. And down the road come 6 white stallions leading a white wagon. It pulled up, and 6 cousins unload the coffin from the hearse and carry it up the winding walk. Mr. Percy laid out, and don't he look like all goodness and mercy? With a satin pillow under his head. He was the belle of the ball. Little children were singing from the portico as the coffin was carried into the house. Safe in his alabaster chamber, untouched by morning, untouched by noon. It looked like there was a tiny smile on Mr. Percy's face, but that must have been my imagination. Well, they laid him out in the grand hall, and dinner was served, for Mr. Percy not only had an eye towards heaven, but he thought waste a terrible abomination and meant to combine feast and funeral so that he need not put up overnight those guests who had traveled from far away. So the Reverend, he blessed the food, and we all sat on 3 corners of the room with Mr. Percy laid out in the center so everybody could see him and he could hear everybody. The Reverend blessed the food, and it's a fine meal. Miss Millie did herself proud. Ham and potatoes, chicken fried just right. Well, I'm eating with the young'uns and Mr. Percy's relations sitting on all sides around me. Then Mr. Perry stood up to speak and say how the passing of their auntie put Mr. Percy in the mind of final things. That's when Mr. Percy clears his throat to correct Mr. Perry, but Mr. Perry didn't catch it right away. So Mr. Percy commenced to clear his throat again, but he ain't moving, just steady laying there. Finally, Mr. Percy cleared his throat so loud that the folks way down at the Natchez Landing must have heard him. And finally, Mr. Perry understands that he has to conduct the ceremonies properly, as if Mr. Percy truly was dead and gone. So he began again. He was a man before his time, like our daddy and his daddy's daddy before him. He upheld the sign and symbol of what it meant to be a walker: truth, integrity, and work. Now, he would have prospered even more, as the world accounts prosperity, if he did not uphold the Walker family tradition to avoid close association with anything ebonine. All of a sudden, up popped Mr. Percy's head out of the coffin, his eyes wide. Mr. Perry knew he'd done wrong then, speaking that word, so he tries again, clearing his throat now. And Mr. Percy eased back down real slow and closed his eyes. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that excellent reading. I must say, like, to talk about a storyteller, like really personifying the story, I really felt like I was there in the setting, immersed in all of this. Thank you so much to all of our readers for tonight. And I guess I'll give the floor over to Tanya. Tanya, I think you're muted.
I just wanted to open up for a moment the webinar to the attendees, who's the people out there, in case you have any questions to ask the authors. This was just, thank you so much, Stanley. I mean, your imagination is so far reaching, and I know how hard it is for fiction to be read in readings because we can't get the entire thing, but trust me, these are just like chock full of like such strange, uncanny moments. Jess, I'm thinking of that really uncanny encounter between Nina and Sarah that comes at the very end of your short story. And the poetry was just like terrific it was terrific to hear the rhythms and them recited. So I'm just going to open up the Q&A, in case anybody has questions.
Tanya, I
Yeah.
just wanted to, I loved Adedayo's boy poem. I wanted him to talk about it a little bit. I like the vibrancy of it, and I like the sweetness of it, and I just wanted to know what he wants to do with it.
So thank you very much for the. Am I allowed to answer?
Absolutely.
Yeah, sure. Oh, thank you very much for the question, Robert. So I actually like had completed my manuscript, and then somebody that's actually like working with me actually said that I think that you need to actually add a little bit of personality into the poem and into the book rather. So I think that it was actually like one of the last poems that I actually wrote for the book. And what I was trying to do there was that I was trying to like mirror my childhood, tell stories that, I mean, everyday stories of living as a young boy in the 1990 into the 2000 into the 2000 early 2000s in Nigeria, in the countryside, Ibadan. You know, it was actually like quite surreal time, but we were also very innocent people. But also in that innocence, we were getting kidnapped. I personally was also like kidnapped, although I luckily escaped, interestingly. And so I'm like just trying to like mirror the joy that we actually like experiencing at that particular time that was actually like very hard to live in as a young child, whether boy or girl. And I was actually telling my narrative as from the point of view of a young boy. I just wanted to like, collect not just my own experience, but the experiences of my friends that I grew up with, some that are still alive, some that are dead. And that was why I actually like had a lot of name dropping in the poem, collected both alive and dead. So nobody would actually like know who is alive and who's dead. I just wanted to, let everybody have their own moments in that poem. And I hope that I was able to do that.
Can I say thank you for that? And one of the things that your comments make me realize is that the poor people who read actually you guys, it's very different stuff, but all of it sort of hangs together. And I think a lot of it is that a lot of the feel of all of the pieces is in fact surreal, and it takes you to these very sort of normal places, and then whoo, does something crazy with each of the with the poems and also with the short story. Really amazing work.
Thank you.
We have a question from James Turner for Stan. Do you think your voice is changing compared to past stories?
That's an interesting question. I think what I'm doing is having fun with different voices, following really whatever the story requires. So this novel has a lot of different individuals in it. So in the people that the main character Samuel meets in his travels, in his quest to find his father, he meets all kinds of people. And I try to give voice to all the different individuals that he meets. So I think that's probably what you're hearing, is that you're hearing a lot of different voices of the very different characters. But I really do follow the needs of the story, which whatever the voice is required by the story.
Great, thanks. I can't wait to read the entire novel. I hope it gets picked up soon, and I hope I can't wait to read everybody's work in collections that are published soon. I have a question for Jess. The other stories that you're working on, do they also take place in this nursing home or perhaps in other places?
No, they don't. So the way the book shaped up is every person lives in a building. So each chapter is from the perspective of a different neighbor. At the beginning of the book, a drug raid takes place, which is something that really happened when I was growing up. So, it weaves in and out of the different things that these neighbors are going through. Some of them are directly related to the drug raid. Some of them are just sort of just other things the neighbors are going through that aren't really related, but they all kind of puzzle together in ways you'll see at the end of the book. It's always weird talking about a novel because it's like I can't talk about the climax because I want people to buy the book, right? But all these things intersect and come together in different ways. And it ultimately is a novel. For me, it's a love letter to the South Bronx, which is where I was born and raised. But it is also just commentary on the war on drugs and what it did for particularly Black men in the neighborhood, and stress it put on, therefore, Black women, Latino women, or whatever, to sort of have to take the place of men, because thanks to the Rockefeller, drug laws, if you had any kind of drugs on you, you were just put away for 15 years minimum. So you just had this vacuum in these communities and these families that had to be filled. And that's really what the novel's about, in short. Yeah.
Again, I can't wait to read it. Does anybody have any other questions for the readers? If not, I just have a few announcements. So I just wanted to talk about how this issue arose. So not long ago, the editorial board decided to alternate between themed issues like our climate issue and the forthcoming species issue, and unthemed issues like this one we're celebrating today. The unthemed issues are so exciting to our staff because we have the flexibility to feature authors that are less well-known. Like those making their debut in this issue, like Winnell Felix, Zakara Galliard, and Issa Quincy. You are going to hear more about those authors soon. So we get to feature those authors alongside those who are more well-known, like Myron Hardy and Ama Kajo. If you'd like to support the magazine, those that are out there, by buying this issue or getting a subscription, please go to the link I put in the chat a couple of times. Because if you have a print copy, you'll be better able to see all the artwork, including Jana Didier's collages, May Clemente's 3D paintings, and Colette Brasilia's sculptures. We are, as Robert said at the very beginning, we are a literary and visual arts magazine. And I'll drop that link in the chat before we leave as well. We wanted to wrap up by touting our recent successes and the recent successes of our contributors, and by advertising a job. First off, earlier this year, Maurice Condé delivered our first ever Rajat Naoji lecture. We were over the moon to have her here in Cambridge to celebrate her whole career and life as a writer. We'll host another Rajat Naoji lecturer in the spring of 2025. So every other year we'll be doing that. And now for our contributors. Leah Penniman, as Robert said, won a 2024 Pushcart Prize for her essay, Black Land Matters, Climate Solutions in Black Agrarianism in T133 Climate. The issue previous to this one, please check it out. Also, a few contributors to this essay have books coming out this fall. Please be on the lookout for Taylor Biases. I done clicked my heels 3 times. That comes out with Soft Skull Press, and Myron Hardy's Aurora Americana from Princeton University Press. That also comes out this fall. Harriet Mullen also has a new book coming out called Open Leaves, Poems from Earth, which includes poems that originally appeared in Transition's climate issue. Last but not least, the job. So in keeping with Transition's activist, Pan-Africanist, and progressive roots, Transition Magazine is dedicated to building a Black editorial pipeline. With this in mind, we have set up the Hortense Spillers Fellowship for Emerging Editors of African Descent. That fellow will be paid at a higher rate than other editorial staff. Moreover, our aim is to send all our editorial fellows on to higher profile venues like the Atlantic and the New Yorker, fully prepared to identify and develop writers and thinkers of the African diaspora. Ideally, the Spillers Fellow, here come the requirements. Ideally, the Spillers Fellow would have an MFA in creative writing or an MA in literary editing. We are looking for a very well-read and well-connected individual who will pursue and build literary relationships with tenacity and tact. The fellow will be expected to identify and solicit authors who are at the beginning of their careers, as well as those who are well-established or peaking. The editorial fellow will help authors develop their crafts and realize their ambitions, guiding them through all stages of the editorial process. Most important of all, however, the Spillers editorial fellow will become, we hope, a leader in the increasingly interrelated world of African and African diasporic writing. So you can stay tuned on our website, or you can write me an email for details for how to apply. Soon, the current Hortense Spillers editorial fellow, Rachel Roberson, will be leaving us, which is sad, but the fellowship really lasts just a year. So if you have any questions about that, you can email me. And if you want to also buy one of the issues, I'm going to put that in the chat again. Vasantha, is there a way that we can take a picture before we leave, maybe for posterity or socials?
Absolutely. So, all right, everyone is already here and smiling.